And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Dr. Tony Cicoria, board-certified orthopedic surgeon who was struck by lightning and had a near-death experience. Dr. Cicoria, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Doc, if you don't mind, let's start on the day that you got struck by lightning and go from there.
Okay. So it's August of 1994, and we're having a big family communal birthday party. 4 or 5 people in my wife's family had birthdays in that month, and rather than having individual birthdays, they would have a venue where they would have everybody come to one place. And so we met at a place called Sleepy Hollow Lake, which is just below Albany, New York. And we were just there for that. There's about 25, 26 people with kids running all over the place. And my job was to run the barbecue. So I was positioned outside, and we had rented a pavilion for all these people, and the party's going on the second floor. I'm on the ground floor, running the barbecue, and started out as a nice sunny day, and I wasn't paying attention, and I was outside cooking, and I got a break, and I thought, well, I'll have one of my relatives watch the grill, and I'm going to go call my mother on the phone just to make sure she's all right, because she was not going to be there. And so I walk around to the front of the building, and there's a payphone attached to the building. And I try to call my mom, and she doesn't answer. And I let it ring 5 or 6 times and finally gave up. And I was just getting ready to hang the phone up. And what I was not aware of is that a big storm cloud had come up over the lake, and I was oblivious to it. And as I went to hang up the phone, I got the phone just away from my face, and I saw this huge flash of light come out of the phone and this loud crack, and it hit me in the face and just threw me back like a rag doll. And as I was being thrown backwards, I had the strangest sensation of moving forward, which didn't make any sense to me. And then I remember standing there, and I'm looking at the phone dangling again against the wall, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, I know I got hit by lightning. I just saw that. And I know I got thrown backwards, and I don't understand what this weird sensation of moving forward was. And nothing was making sense. And right about that time, I'm standing at the bottom of a staircase, and my mother-in-law is at the top of the staircase, and she's screaming, and she's running down the stairs right at me. And I'm thinking, holy crap, what's going on? And as she came down the stairs, she was not looking at me. She was looking off to her left. And when she came down to the bottom of the stairs, she cut right in front of me and took off. And I'm like, okay. So I turned around to follow her. And I took a few steps, and suddenly I'm confronted with myself on the ground. And I remember standing there right next in front of the body, and I'm going, my normal vernacular. I said, "Oh shit, I'm dead." And it was a shock to me. because I guess I always expected there would be some sort of a signal, but there was nothing. It was just 1 minute I was alive and well, and the next minute I was not in the body anymore. And so at that point, I'm standing there, and there was a woman waiting to use the phone right behind me, and it turns out that she was a nurse, and which is amazing because this place is in the middle of nowhere, and then to have a nurse standing there behind you, if you get hit by lightning, is pretty amazing. And so she gets down to start doing CPR, and she was there with her young teenage daughter. And then again, they were just waiting to use the phone. So she starts to do CPR, and I'm standing there watching, and I can hear everybody, I can see everybody, but nobody can hear or see me. And at that point, I came to the realization that, geez, whoever I am, I always am. And that was just an amazing realization that came to me as I was standing there. And then, since nobody could hear me or see me, I said, well, hell, there's no point in standing here. I wanted to go check on my family. So I turned around and I walk over to that staircase, and I start going up the stairs. And I got to about the third stair, and I realized my legs are starting to dissolve. And normally when I go upstairs, I look down at the stairs so I don't trip and fall on my face. And I noticed that my legs are losing form. And that was a bit of a shock as well. And as I got to the top of the staircase, I had lost all form, and I was just this ball of energy. And at that point, the stairs actually go to the left, and I just went right straight through the wall in front of me, and I came out right over my wife's head, and she was sitting painting children's faces. And I made a special note of who the kids were, where they were, how they were standing, and in what order. And then I just kept going, and I was moving in a diagonal through the room, and then I went out through the roof. When I got out through the roof, things really got interesting, because I felt like I had fallen into a river of pure positive energy. And it was absolutely nothing but absolute love and absolute peace in this flow of energy. And I remember it had a bluish white light, and it was sparkling, like if you've ever been swimming in a freshwater pond, and the sun is coming down through the water. It has this sparkly bluish white light appearance to it. And that's what this was a lot like. And as I was standing there, I started looking around, and I could see that this energy, and actually I could see the streams of the energy. It looked like a sine wave that went through everything. And this energy actually went through everything that I saw, and composed everything. And I remember thinking, holy mackerel, this is the God energy. And for lack of a better way to describe it, but if you could ever imagine a feeling of absolute love and absolute peace with nothing else in it, that's what this was like. And at this point, I was starting to get ecstatic about it. This is the greatest thing that could ever happen to somebody. And it felt like I was in the flow of something. And I could feel that I had the sensation of speed and direction. I had no idea where I was going, but I was accelerating in some place. And as that went on, I had a short experience where I saw the high points and low points of my life just kind of flash like a collage on a wall. And I saw all of these different pictures, but nothing in depth. And there was no real analysis of it. It was just, oh, by the way, here are some things that happened along the pathway. But at that point, I was just absolutely ecstatic, and came to the realization that this was the greatest thing that could ever happen to somebody. But at that point, just at the point where I was so excited to be there, it was like somebody suddenly flipped a switch, and I was back in my body, and I was angry. I remember thinking, I don't want to come back. Don't make me do this. But it wasn't my choice. And so suddenly I'm lying there. I'm still unconscious, but I know I'm back in the body because it hurts like hell. Where it hit me in the mouth and came out my foot felt like somebody had taken two hot pokers and stuck them in those two places. And I realized that the lady who was kneeling next to me had stopped doing CPR. And so I realized that, okay, I'm obviously back, but I'm still, I was still unconscious. I couldn't open my eyes to see or anything. And over the course of several minutes, I was able to open my eyes and start looking around. And I looked at her and I wanted to thank her for saving my life. But stupidly, the only thing that came out was, "It's okay, I'm a doctor." And I'm like, oh, Jesus, what a stupid thing to say. And I realized, okay, you're not thinking very clearly. Maybe just keep your mouth shut. And so I did. And they called the police and they called the ambulance, and I refused to go to the hospital because if you get struck by lightning, you're either alive or dead. There's not much in between. And I didn't want to go sit in the emergency room for 4 hours because I knew what that would be like. And at that point, I opted to just have my family take me home, and we called my neurologist and my cardiologist on the way home. And these are both friends of mine. And I said, I told them what happened and asked them if they would take a look at me. And so we went directly home and did that instead. And everybody had the same conclusion. Well, you're lucky to be here. Nothing seems to be significantly wrong. And so, just I went on about my business. It took me about a week to recover enough to where I was thinking clearly and went back to work. And then I remember thinking, okay, what the hell was the meaning of this? When I started thinking about the probabilities of, getting hit by lightning, number one, and having it hit the building and losing just enough current that it didn't fry me in my shoes, and then to have a nurse standing there right behind me to do CPR in case something bad happened. And I thought about all that, and I said, "There's nothing random about this. This was purposeful, and I couldn't explain why or what it meant or anything else." And at that point, I just went on about my normal life. I went back to work, and within a couple of weeks of that, I had this insatiable desire to hear classical piano music, which was a big departure for me. I was a kid of the 60s, and it was rock and roll, and really wasn't much of anything else. But it was overwhelming to the point that I actually drove to Albany, about an hour away, to a store that had classical music. And when I went into the store, the CD just jumped off the shelf into my hands almost. And it was Vladimir Ashkenazy, a famous Russian pianist, playing his favorite Chopin. And I was so smitten with it, I couldn't stop listening to it. And I listened to it all day long, made everybody else listen to it. And I'm sure the people I worked with were sick of it, as well as my family, but it was just the way it was. And at that point, within that 2-week period of time, I realized it's not going to be enough to hear this music. I need to know how to play it. And I thought, okay, which is a problem since I didn't know how to play and I didn't have a piano. My mother had made me take piano lessons when I was 7 years old for a year. And out of threat of life and limb, I did that, and then promptly quit after the obligatory year was at an end. And so, here I am thinking, okay, I need to be able to play this music. And then the next day, one of our babysitters came by and said, I'm moving, and I had this old upright piano that I love. Could I store it at your house for a year? And so I thought, okay, this is fortuitous. I have this feeling where I need to learn how to play music, and suddenly there's a piano that appears. So she brought the piano over, and I went and got a couple of books on trying to teach myself how to play, which was an exercise in futility. And I tried starting to do that. And then within a month of the lightning strike, and it's now a couple of weeks since I've gotten this thing about the music, and I have a dream. And this dream was like an out-of-body experience where I was walking out onto a stage, and I'm already out on the stage, and I'm playing piano at a concert hall. And as I'm walking toward myself, I'm listening to this music, and I come to the realization that this is not somebody else's music, this is mine. And so I really paid attention to it, and I stood behind myself as I was playing, and the ending of this piece had a loud ending, and it woke me up. And I looked at the clock, and it's about 3:15 in the morning, and I thought, wow, that was a crazy, powerful dream. And I got up and I went out to that piano, and I was trying to plunk out some of the things that I had heard. But at that point, I didn't know how to play, and I didn't know how to write anything. So I said, the hell with this, I'm going back to bed. And I did. But then I had to get up at 6:30 anyway. And at that point, what was weird was whenever I sat down at the piano or was being quiet, the music from the dream would start to play in my head. So it was downloaded into my brain, and it just would start playing all the time, especially when I was at the piano. But then if I didn't pay attention to it, it was like a little 2-year-old. It's like, Daddy, Daddy, play with me. And, if I didn't, it would become intrusive to the point where, I'd be trying to work and it would be going on in my head louder than normal. So I learned very quickly to pay attention to it, and that would kind of keep it under control. And so within this, as I'm going along this process, I realized that I am not going to be able to teach myself how to play. And the first signal of that was I was trying to learn a piece of music that was on the CD, and I had gotten all the sheet music from the pieces that were on that CD of the Ashkenazi. And one of the pieces was a Fantasy Impromptu, which is a piece by Chopin. And I was trying to learn it, and my daughter's best friend Jackie was over at my house. And her mom came to pick her up, and she heard me banging away at the piano. Her mom is an accomplished violinist and musically trained. And she heard me trying to play this piece of music, and she walked in and said, "What in the world are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to learn this piece of music." I said, "But I don't understand why the two hands don't line up." And she looked at me and she said, "They're not supposed to." And I said, "Well, why would somebody write a piece of music where the music in one hand doesn't line up with the other?" And she said, "It's called a polyrhythm." And she said, "I'm not going to even try to explain that to you. You need to get a music teacher." So she gave me the name of Sandy McCain, who was at that point was the head of the music department at Hartwick College. And she was a Juilliard trained pianist. And she was somebody that people would take lessons with. So I called her and I asked if she would consider taking on an old guy. At the time, I was 42. And she, she had me come and do an audition, and she wanted me to play some of the things that I was working on, which I did. And she said, "Okay, I'll take you on as a student, but number one rule, you are not allowed to play any of these pieces of music again until I tell you that you can." And the reason being is I had already gotten so many bad habits and poor technical processes that I was doing myself harm. And so she made me start right at the very bottom and built up from there. And this process went on for quite some time. And I began, I was playing, I would have lessons for 2 hours a week with her, and I would practice in the morning from, usually I got up at 5, and I would practice until I went to work at 6:30, and then I would do my normal 12 hours. And when I came home, I would go right back to the piano again. I would have some time with the kids, and it was always my joy to put them to bed. And as soon as that was over, I was back at the piano, and I would be there till 12, 1 o'clock in the morning. And I was an absolute zealot, and it wound up destroying my marriage um, and changed my life in a lot of ways. And at that point, I was continuing on this process. And then I started going to a piano camp for adults called the Sonata, which is in Burlington, Vermont. And once a month, there was a camp where you could go and they'd be there with 30 or 35 people. Everybody is there to play piano and just can't think of anything else. So it was an incredible place for me to be at, and I'd learned to play. And I started in 2002 going there, And then in 2006, I was going to go to the piano camp. And I had, as part of my process in trying to figure out what had happened to me, I had started seeing a psychic medium, Linda Dickinson, and I went to see her in February of 2006. And when I walked in and sat down, she suddenly jumped up and said, "Tell me you're going to music camp this year." And I said, "Well, I hadn't decided yet." And she said, "You have to go." I'm like, "Okay, why?" And she said, "You're going to meet a woman there who's going to change your life." And I'm like, "Okay," but no more explanation than that. And so I made plans to go, and I would always go in May. That was my month to go. And so in May, I went, and the owner's sister, Erica Vanderlyn Feidner. Erica was also a concert pianist, but she was the #1 salesperson at Steinway in New York. And she had suddenly had left Steinway and jumped ship to Bosendorfer, which was another type of piano. And she brought 5 or 6 pianos into piano camp for people to play on as part of her marketing strategy. And she and I got talking about all this stuff with the music and the lightning. And she said, "There's only one person that can tell this story." And I said, "And who's that?" And she said, "Oliver Sachs." And I said, I didn't know who Oliver was other than he wrote the book Awakenings, but he was a famous neurologist in New York City, and who she knew. And so, this was in May of 2006. And I went, we did the piano camp ended, and I went home and not thinking much more of it until about a month later, I get a phone call from Oliver Sacks. And Oliver says, "I'd like you to become one of my patients. And I was wondering if you would come down to New York City for an interview." And I said, "Sure, I don't have anything to lose." And so in August of 2006, I go down to New York City, and I get to spend a day with Oliver Sacks, which was an amazing experience for me. An incredible mind, incredible human being. And I literally spent the entire day with him. At the end of the day, we're standing in the doorway getting ready to say goodnight. And he looks at me and he says, "The music from the dream went through an awful lot of trouble to get here. The least you can do is write it." And I thought, wow, coming from somebody like him, I was absolutely overwhelmed. And when I went home, the first thing I did was I bought a music program called Sibelius, which is like writing music for dummies. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to play music, and then it transcribes it and puts it on a screen on your computer. And that was the way I started to write the music that I had been hearing. And there were sticking points where I didn't know how to write things. And if I couldn't figure it out, I would ask my piano teacher, and she would try to give me some knowledge of how to do things. And I just worked nonstop for the next 7 months every night. And it took me that length of time to get it written. And my thought was I would play it for the piano camp in May of 2007. So before the piano camp, I did finish it, and I played it for the piano group, and it was well received. And at that point, I thought, okay, well, I still don't know what this all means yet. And then while I was at piano camp, Oliver Sachs calls, and Oliver says, I'd like to use your story in my book. And I said, I don't see why not. I don't have anything to hide. And he said, good, because you're chapter 1 and it's coming out in the New Yorker magazine, July 23rd. I'm like, oh, it was kind of a shock. I wasn't expecting it to be so ready to go. And sure enough, it came out in the New Yorker magazine in that month. And then all hell broke loose after that. I started getting phone calls from all over the place. And one of the first calls I got was from Carlton Clay, who was a head of music at the State University of New York in Oneonta, which is where we lived. And Carlton called me and said, look, I read about this story in the New Yorker and was wondering if you would come and teach a class. And I thought, okay, I'd be glad to. And then 2 weeks later, he calls back and he says, there's been an awful lot of people asking about this. He said, when you teach the class, would you also play for them? And I thought, sure, why not? And then this continues on. And about a month later, he calls again and says, this is really getting kind of crazy, and we would like you to consider doing a concert. And I said, they have a big performing arts theater at the college. And I said, I don't think I can do that. I said, I've never done anything like that. I wouldn't even know how to begin. And somehow he talked me into it, and I agreed. And we picked January of 2008 to be the day to do this concert. And I picked my birthday, January 29th, kind of as a rebirth, I guess, if you will. And so I promptly called my music teacher and I said, Sandy, I got conned into doing this. And by Carlton, and we both knew Carlton. And I said, do you think you could get me ready for it? And she said, yeah, but it's going to take a huge amount of time commitment from you. We're going to need 3 to 4 hours a day. And I was like, wow. And so, I said, okay, let's do it. And so we started working every day, 3 to 4 hours at various times during the day. And to get me ready for it. And then about a month before this concert, Carlton calls me again and said, it's even gotten crazier. He said, the BBC One and Granada Media and German television want to have crews there to document this. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. And I said, hell, I've come this far. So I continued. And so on that day, when I went out onto the stage, there were 3 television crews out there in front of me. and the place is packed. The amphitheater is packed. There's people standing all over the place. And I managed to get through the concert and without making too many bad errors. And I remember going to the green room beforehand and was saying my prayers, and I said to God or whoever was listening, "You guys went through a lot of trouble to get me here." I said, "Don't embarrass us both and let me do a terrible job." And so, I was thankful that I made it through, and then it just took on a life of its own. As Oliver's book came out in 2007, and it was called Musicophilia: Tales of Music in the Brain. And so it gained the music gained a lot of steam and a lot of notoriety, both from that and from the concert. And then I wound up doing concerts all over the place for a fairly lengthy period of time, and it still goes on. So that's kind of the gist of it.
Do you think that your dream was actually you in a past life or a parallel dimension and you picked up that song?
I've thought about all of this stuff, and certainly I think that there's some evidence that there's a past life experience with music, and I believe that because my son, who and one day when he was 12 years old, came up out of the basement with a CD, and I said, "What's this?" And he says, "It's a CD of music I wrote." And I'm like, "What?" And at that point, we had no idea that he was musical. And he ultimately went to Berklee College of Music in Boston. And so there's some genetic predisposition. And is there genetic memory that goes along with that? You have to believe that there is. And then, I mean, I've been to a number of people who specialize in what's called the Akashic records, which is the records of everything that's ever happened in the universe. And both of them had said that I had been a composer and musician in previous lives. So, I think that there's a lot of possibilities in those two things. And then, then it brings up the whole other idea of parallel universes. And certainly there's, if you follow much in the world of physics, that's becoming a popular belief, that there's an infinite number of possibilities that can exist at any one time. And I certainly would believe that that I could have experienced that as well.
How have your thoughts on consciousness changed, especially as a doctor, before and after the lightning strike?
Before the lightning, I was absolutely driven, and I was going down a pathway of academic orthopedics. I was doing research. I was publishing. I was really going down that pathway, and because that seemed to be important. After the lightning, and none of it seemed to be important anymore. And I realized that people are what are important, and not being concerned with self, but in being concerned with others is important. And so it changed the way I interacted with people, and changed really the pathway of my life, because I just completely abandoned my aspirations of going into academic orthopedics and wanting to be a big shot at a university someplace. Those things just didn't matter.
How did the experience change you as a clinician in the ER?
As a clinician, the things that were really changed was that I would always look at people, and I would take the whole person, as opposed to some isolated problem. And I found that I became much more people-centric, as opposed to problem-centric. And so my approach to people became very different. And one of the things from the lightning was that I could feel people's aura. And I know some people claim that they can see them, but I could feel disruptions in the electrical surface. So if somebody was having a problem with their shoulder, for example, if I could pass my hand over, and it felt like I was moving my hand through static electricity. And so it made it easy to find places where, somebody had a pinched nerve and it wasn't quite clear where it was coming from. I could find it. So it became very helpful in that regard. But it just changed. It changed the way I looked at everything. And I grew up as a Catholic, and there were a lot of things that I didn't like about that religion, but I had always been brought up into it, and it was just the way it was. But after the lightning, I realized what was spiritual and what was religious are very different. I became very spiritual and much less religious.
Do you feel that memories are stored outside of the brain in either the Akashic records or some sort of quantum hologram, or they're actually stored in both?
I think that memory is stored externally. And I say that because there have been lots of studies that have been done where people have calculated the amount of information that would have to be stored in the brain, and it would have to be the size of a building. And that obviously is not the case. And there's lots of scientists that have suggested that memory is stored elsewhere, and that there's part of the brain that is able to access it. And I think that that's most likely true. And I say that because with the music, not only did I have the music from the dream, but I've had lots of other episodes where music has essentially downloaded into my brain. And it usually comes at moments when I'm emotional about something, which kind of opens me up to wherever this is coming from. And then the music comes, and then but it's downloaded. It's actually sitting there until I'm ready to do something with it.
Well, do you think all of the great composers are that way?
Yep.
They just come, especially Mozart, I think. It just came to him, and luckily he
You
had
know,
the ability to transcribe it onto paper.
it's interesting. I have read all of many, many books about the great composers. And every one of them says very similar things about that. They all say that the music comes from someplace else. Either they have a muse, or in Mozart's case, Mozart was famous for saying, "It comes to me in finished form. All I do is write it down." And that was true. But Beethoven was also famous for saying, somebody criticized him for writing a piece of music a certain way. And he says, "It's the way it was given to me. I'm not changing it." And, Brahms was always talking about it. He had a muse that would come to him and would help him to write music. So everybody seemed to be connecting with an alternate source. And a lot of popular musicians all say the same thing, that they're able to tie into some frequency where the music exists. And that's what it really feels like. And it certainly does for me. That when I connect to it, it feels like a frequency that I'm listening into, but that I'm connected with.
Do you think it's possible that we're all supposed to have these abilities? It's just somehow they've gotten shut off and the lightning strike turned it back on for you?
I think that we all have abilities that we have no idea that we have. And case in point, I've also been studied by Daryl Treefort, who's a doctor who specializes in savants, and he had asked me to be one of his patients also, and he put me in a category of what's called sudden savants, and these are people who had no idea that they had an ability until either got hit in the head, got struck by lightning, got sick, had surgery. There's just a myriad number of different causes. But the end result was that all of these people developed an ability they had no idea they had. And in some people, it was just memory. You could ask somebody, um, what date was this? And they could tell you what day it was, just going back infinitum. Um, Other people could paint or sculpt and had no knowledge of how they knew how to do that. So there's lots of examples in those groups of people where they did not have a particular skill and suddenly they did. So my answer to that question is absolutely. I think we all have the ability, and we don't know how to turn it on or off.
I've had many near-death experience guests share with me that they had some sort of new ability after their NDE, many of them being some sort of psychic ability, which I don't think is traditionally considered part of the savant syndrome, but I feel like it should be added.
Yeah, I mean, I've I've met lots of people who have had, um, as a residual of their near-death experience, the ability to see future events, to be able to tell things about people they would have no way of knowing. So there's actually a lot of that, um, and I think that it's purposefully left out of the descriptors of the near-death experience because it's in a very gray area of paranormal that nobody understands. And so rather than taking the risk of somebody thinking that they're lunatics, they don't talk about it.
Have you figured out what your purpose is, or at least what the purpose was of you having the NDE?
Not entirely. I have struggled with this ever since it happened. And I've read hundreds of books. I've talked to thousands of people, and trying to understand for myself, what it meant and, what I was supposed to do with it. And for the large extent of it, I have just taken the position that, it will present itself when it's supposed to. And I have no preconceived notion of where it takes me or what I'm supposed to do with it. But I find that it's important for me to talk about it and share it with people in the hopes that it's going to help somebody else. And I think that that's one of the things. I think that, if I had to define a specific purpose, I think that one of those purposes is helping to increase the consciousness in general of people. And I have found that there's a lot of people who've been having experiences like these, but they don't talk about it. They're afraid to talk about it. And it's only now becoming something that people talk about in medical schools, and they're teaching videos that are being made for medical students where they're being introduced to, what do you do if you have a patient that tells you that they've had this kind of experience? And there have been some incredible documentations of people who've had experiences. There was one lady, I'm drawing a blank on her name, but she had an aneurysm in her brain that if it ruptured, she would die instantly. And her family physician sent her to see neurosurgeon Robert Spetzler in Phoenix, Arizona. And he was a pioneer in this procedure called standstill, where to operate on this, safely, you had to put somebody on bypass, heart bypass, and drain the blood out of the brain. And so she opted to do this. And in this surgery, they have to open up your skull to get to this aneurysm. But to do it, they have to lower your body temperature. They have to put you on bypass. They have to make sure the brain is completely dead. There's no signal coming from it at all. And your heart is stopped. And they did all this stuff, and it's all documented. She was absolutely flatline, both cardiac and brain electrically. And once the surgery was underway, she had an out-of-body experience where she popped out of her body, and she was standing behind the surgeon, and she was making specific notes about all the equipment, what it sounded like, what it looked like, where it was placed on the tables. She documented all that stuff. And she left her body and went to one of the tunnels that opens up for a lot of people. And there were some family members who met her there. They walked with her for a period of time and told her she had to go back. And she was angry about it and didn't want to go back. And one of her relatives pushed her out of the tunnel. which coincided with her heart being restarted. And so, and she was famous. She was on television. She was on a lot of things were written about her because of this whole incident. And it makes it very crystal clear that these things do exist, and we're just basically ignorant.
In your opinion, why do you think we come here in the first place?
Why do I think?
Why do you think we come to Earth or incarnate into the Earth anyways?
Okay.
Like, what's the point of all this?
I think essentially we are a duality. We have a physical form and we have a spiritual form, and the two co-inhabit at the same time. They ultimately diverge at the time that the physical body dies. But the spiritual body lives on and is eternal. And I think that the whole point of us coming through here and going through this process is to develop spiritually with the goal of being able to rejoin with the source. And it's not something you're automatically given. You have to earn it. And so we go through this process of learning in this incarnation, if you will. And unfortunately, it doesn't all happen with one. So you have to keep going through this process and gaining spiritual knowledge and spiritual points that say that it's okay for you to rejoin the source energy. So I think that that's what we're doing here, and we're learning. So we're the whole purpose of us being here is to learn and to gain spiritual knowledge.
I found it fascinating when you were talking about that when you were walking upstairs and looking down at your legs and they started to disappear. Do you feel that what you had was just a memory of your physical body that was dissolving?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as I was walking, I expected that I would have a certain physical attribute, um, and as that time moved on, I realized that that was not the case. So I think that my brain, well, not my brain, but I guess my memory, that I was something, really kind of neutralized, and I went back to, excuse me, I went back to what I was before.
If somebody wants to go and listen to your music, how do they do that?
It's available on CD, and it's also available digitally. You can get it at Amazon. You can get it at CD Baby, which is another site. Most of the big music sites, you can just download it from them.
Do you also have a book?
I'm actually in the process of writing one, and I wanted it to be really to go in depth to what the general consensus was of why we're here and what it is we're supposed to be gaining. And so I've spent a lot of time reading everything I can get my hands on. And so the book is about halfway finished, and I still have a lot of work to do with it, but I think it will come to fruition when it's supposed to. And I think that that's true about everything in life. Things don't happen unless they're supposed to happen.
Do you have anything else that you're working on that you want people to know about?
No, mostly the things that I'm working on are the music, and my book, and I continue to work, and I continue to spend as much time with my family as I can.
If people want to ask you questions, are you open to that?
Absolutely.
What's the best way to contact you?
Email. It's just all lowercase t Cicoria at yahoo.com.
Well, before we wrap it up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
Know that you are eternal and you are loved by a source that you cannot even comprehend. And I think the biggest thing that I learned from my experience was that when I was standing outside of my body and I was looking down at the carcass that was there and realizing that that was not me. I am who I am always. And I think that's important to know, that, our external manifestation of who we are is a false flag. We're not that person. And we learn a lot about ourselves from the experiences the body goes through, but we are independent of it.
Dr. Cicoria, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.